Okay, chapter 7 is going to be focused more on drawing and painting. So drawing and painting in Photoshop is one of the other kind of key things it can do. So like we have raster editing, which is what we've been doing with photography and compositing so far, and also straight up raster creations. Like how do we actually make images in Photoshop from scratch? We're going to look at the new document window and a little bit about resolution. And then we're going to really dig into something called the mixer brush while poking the brush and pencil brush tool at the same time. So our goal today is to make something like what we've got here on the screen. So we've got a drawing painting right here, and it's kind of like the classic circle that you see in most drawing classes. Oops. And so like we're just going to look at how to draw and paint this orb. And while doing it, we're going to look at some of the ways that Photoshop can have some advantages over doing it in real life. Now, doing this in real life, I still think is easier. But doing it in Photoshop has a couple of easy advantages. Like one, I can just split everything up into its own layer, and then we can use layer masks to make it so that we automatically stay within the lines while we're drawing and painting, making certain parts of that much easier and smoother for us in the system. Now, unfortunately, even before we really get to drawing and painting, we have to talk about different ways that we can get our mouse strokes understood in the program. So there's kind of three traditional ways to get your strokes registered. It's like you have a mouse pad. Hopefully you're not using one of those for this chapter. You'll be in a world of headache. And then you also have a 3-button mouse. My advice for this chapter is to at least have a 3-button mouse rather than a trackpad, because a trackpad will be a struggle bus. And that's kind of been true this whole time, but particularly in this chapter. And it's just terms of like smoothness of control, especially if you have a higher DPI count mouse, that can help you out quite a bit. Then we have two other options called a pen tablet and a pen tablet display. And what these are basically, it's like a big mouse trackpad, and then there's a pen that goes with it. And what's really neat about these pens is that it introduces pressure sensitivity. So if I pick up a brush and it's pressure sensitive, let me make the stroke a little bit bigger. And using my own pen tablet here, and if I move my mouse across the screen, you can see that I can change the size and rate that my brush is being applied, which makes it much more dynamic and interesting and easier to draw. And I can tie that to not only size, but also like how much tone is being put down, how much is mixing. Really nice ones will also read angle even. So like if I have a brush tip that isn't a circle, it will understand like the angle that I'm holding my brush. Versus the mouse, where if I just click and drag, I have that line, and that's all I have. Also keep in mind that my mouse cursor appears much larger than the line that's being drawn, because again, as usual, to make these videos a little bit easier for you to see, I have changed my mouse to be much larger. So that's a pen tablet, and so it reads how hard you're pressing down, and it makes drawing natural lines and doing natural shading much easier. Now, one step up from that is going to be what's called a pen tablet display, and that's actually what I've got right here. I've got an X Pen something pen tablet display. And it works exactly the same as this guy, except I can now see directly what I'm drawing and painting on this as a screen. So it's a little bit like an iPad that plugs directly into your computer. Unlike an iPad, this is a second display for your screen that you can draw on. So it's not a standalone computer. It doesn't have a battery in it. Even if I plugged it in somewhere without being plugged into a laptop or desktop, it doesn't do anything. So again, it is a secondary screen that allows me to draw directly onto it using a pen tablet. I'm using a pen for a tablet display. Very good. This is kind of like industry standard for many people who are doing anything in the graphic arts or the arts on the computer. Even like photographers who aren't necessarily drawing and painting, many of them will end up getting pen tablet displays at some point for easier editing. Now, an alternative to this, which isn't pictured here, would be something like an iPad, which does have the Apple Pen. So why wouldn't you just get an iPad with an Apple Pen? Why would you get a pen tablet display? So a pen tablet display is connected to your computer, which means it has access to all of the operating system and stuff that's in it and the power that's in whatever computer you're using to run the program. So it is a much faster, stronger, more robust, more customizable drawing experience than what you'll get on the iPad. So like the version of Photoshop that's on the iPad, they call it Photoshop, but it's not Photoshop. It's a pared down version of it that only works on the iPad. Procreate, on the other hand, has a very successful iPad drawing program that could be used quite professionally. But like right now, like I wouldn't try to use Photoshop as a drawing program on an iPad. So the difference is, do you have access to desktop capabilities and programs, or do you have access to mobile-only programs and capabilities? So it's kind of it's a big trade. All right, let's go ahead and close this because we don't need it anymore. Okay, so we need to create a new document. So we're going to click the New File button, which we've been ignoring this entire semester. So let's go ahead and click New File. In New File, if you have a clipboard, you want to click off it, just click on Default right here. This is going to set up some stuff in the background for us. There's actually a bunch of different ones up here. So like something that you'll find people accidentally do is they'll do film and video and they'll click Create, and it puts these lines on here. And then even when they come back to File New, and they put in new settings over here. Oh, it didn't do it. Usually this will bring back in those kind of irritating blue lines. I wonder if they updated that or if it's just a change I missed. Well, usually it will bring back in those blue lines, and it's really irritating. Like, these are guidelines for helping you lay out stuff for video, and it's kind of part of that template, and it gets remembered usually. So we're going to click on New File, and we're just going to click Default because that sets everything to the default. That doesn't say that you shouldn't use some of these. Some of these are pretty handy, like the 18x24 poster one I like. But it's better just to take full control. So we're going to click Default Photoshop. Right here it says Untitled 1. We can put in our intended final document name. So I'm going to put in Chapter 7-orb drawing. And I will then come down here and we're going to put in some settings. So for our size, let's just do ourselves a favor and work in a standard frame size. So I'm going to do a width of 14 inches. If you're not in inches, go ahead and click on the drop down and pick inches. For height, I'm going to do 11. And again, this is a standard document size. If you want, you can flip the orientation by clicking the orientation buttons. We'll go ahead and just stick with landscape. If we were doing multiple designs in a single document, we could do artboards. And I usually kind of shy away from doing artboards with big files, with big image files, because it tends to get too big on your computer, and you end up in it's called a PSB format, where it's for documents over 2 gigabytes in size. Resolution. So resolution, we talked a little bit about. We want it at 300 in this case, because 300 is our print resolution. So if I was going to print off this when I was done at 11 by 14, we would want it to be at 300. Color mode, we're going to stick in RGB. A little bit more about what bitmap, grayscale, RGB, CMYK, and LAD mean in Chapter 11. For us right now, we're just going to stick in RGB. A really easy thing, and I'm going to say this as many times as I can, RGB for the computer, and then a CMYK for mass market print. If it's going to be on both, start in RGB and convert to CMYK. 8-bit, we're going to go ahead and stay in 8-bit just for some of us that have weaker computers. If you've got a beefy one, you could bump up to 16, but we're going to stay in 8-bit. If we were going to do like professional work, I'd be pretty tempted to hop down into 16. I would avoid 32-bit because there's not going to be a lot of advantages for us, and a bunch of tools just don't work in 32. So I would stick in 8 or 16, and for this assignment, we'll stay in 8. Background content, we'll go ahead and just leave as white. That's fine, but you could do black or some other custom colors. So like if you're one of the people that are into the new drawing shtick of drawing and painting on gray, which actually has a lot of advantages, although old tutorials don't work anymore for you, you could start with gray instead of white. We're going to pop open advanced options, and we're just going to double check that it says sRGB in here somewhere. In my case, since I've resetted all of my preferences, it's set up my working space as sRGB. Normally my working space is Adobe RGB because I usually work towards print. For now, we'll stay in sRGB, kind of in the same idea of working in 8-bit, just to keep everything nice and small. And we're going to be working in black and white anyway. So there's going to be not any real functional difference between 98 and sRGB for us today. If I'm still speaking Greek, Chapter 11. And we'll leave our square pixels. We're not going to get anything gnarly. When you're happy with all your settings and they look like mine, go ahead and click Create. I need to put my pen tablet down because we're going to have to do this with a mouse, because all of you guys are going to probably be on mice. Sad pandas for Mr. Poofall, because he does not like drawing with the mouse. Okay, so first what we want to do is switch our document into painting mode. So far we've been working in Essentials, and we want to work in Painting. So up here in the very top right, we're going to click this drop down, and we're going to pick Painting. Now, if your painting does not look like mine, go ahead and come back up to this drop down and do reset painting. And as normal, oh, look at that. Mine was still set up from, it didn't delete out the preference from that. That's fascinating. My preference deletion should have reset that. Anyway, come up here and click reset, as I'm discovering we all need to do. And we'll want to customize this workspace a little bit before digging into our new tools. So I am going to go ahead and click out this series of lines, and I'm going to get rid of some stuff. Like swatches, navigator, we'll leave these on. I'm going to click and drag history over here to combine with those, just because I'm not going to use them very much. Brushes, I'm going to drag into its own column. So you notice I'm waiting for that blue line to appear, and I'm dropping it in as that column. I'm going to grab my brushes panel, and I'm going to blue line it along the bottom. So I've got them nested together. And I'm going to do myself a favor and drag up just to kind of collapse this down a little bit. Layers, channels, and paths can just hang out here. If you want to, you can close channels and paths because we're not going to use them in this style of drawing. Paths you would use if you're going to come over and putz around with vector. We're not going to. Finally, clone source, tool presets, and libraries are all things we just massively don't care about. Tool presets can be handy as a way of setting up, as another way of setting up custom brushes. But for us, we're not going to use it in this chapter. Just try to keep this already complicated chapter as simple as possible. Now, we are later going to add in some stuff in later chapters for doing some more other drawing and painting types. But for this assignment, this is about right. Okay, so we have multiple ways of mark making in Photoshop. So like we have the pencil tool, the brush tool, and the mixer brush tool. So if I come over here, I've got the brush tool, and if I just stroke, whoop, I get a line, and we can see it's a little fuzzy on the outside, and that's because of my hardness set to 0. But if I crank the hardness up to 100, and I draw the same line, we can see that I have a harder edge. Next, I have the pencil tool, and if I do the same line, although let's get this guy a little bit bigger. What was the other one? 60. And I'll draw another line, whoop, and it's just like those kind of look the same. So like, what's the big deal? What's the difference between these two? So let's zoom in. Z for zoom tool, and we can see this bottom line is nice and soft. It's got this kind of nice graduation of tone going towards the background because the brush was set relatively soft. It was set down here at hardness 0. When we got to this one, the brush was set to hardness 100, and we got this kind of nice cleaner line. But if you look at it closely, maybe not that close because the pixels start appearing, we can see that there is an aliased edge right here where there's kind of a soft transition of pixels. However, if we go up to the one made with the pencil tool, there's no aliased edges. So the difference between the brush and the pencil is anti-aliased edges, aliased edges, anti-aliased, anti-aliased. In most cases, you are going to want to use the regular brush. In fact, let me zoom in one more time so you can see why. If I make like a selection, particularly with something like the magic wand tool, which we'll putz with in chapter 12, and I click over here, we zoom in really far, just like when we were talking about with that panorama stitch we're doing, we can see that some of these pixels got selected and some of them didn't. And if this is on an empty layer instead of a white layer, these would be transparent. But because they're on a white layer, they're actually going to be gray, and that can cause me a massive headache when trying to put stuff together. Now, if I come up to that pencil line, we can see that there is no transparent or gray pixels in that selection. So it can be an easy way to quickly draw certain types of hard edge selections or doing certain types of line art, particularly like 80s pixel art. You're going to be doing that with the pencil tool. All right, let's nuke these 3 lines, and let's look at the tool that we care about, which is the mixer brush tool. The mixer brush tool, I'm going to make a series of Bob Ross metaphors to kind of help us understand what is going on with this tool. Okay, so with the mixer brush tool active, let's go ahead and just make an empty layer so we can see what these things do. And I'm going to change my color to red just to make our lives easier. I changed my color to red by coming over to yonder, clicking and picking red and clicking OK. Why is that why is that showing up as a pink gradient? Clean brush. There we go. That's just been a rendering error in my area. Yeah, it's a rendering error right now. I don't know if that's showing up in the video, but definitely a rendering error. Photoshop's gotten a little buggy since this July update. Okay, so up here at the top, we have a drop down for our size, our hardness, and then different shapes of brushes. We'll be playing with some brush shapes here in a hot second. Then we have a button right here that opens the brushes and brush settings panels, so we're not going to click it. And then we have a preview of what is currently loaded on our brush. So this should be solid red, but it is rendering error array right now. And as I paint on here, it'd be picking up a little bit of white. Next to it, I can click down and I can load my brush up with more paint, or I can clean my brush to remove paint from it. These two highlighted buttons right here do the same thing as these two drop downs. So when this one is turned on, each time I click and then release the mouse, my brush gets cleaned. So like if I was Bob Ross and I'm painting away on my canvas and I'm painting I'm blurring out my background, I'm making my happy little clouds or whatever, and I pick up my 4-inch brush from blending out those blues on the titanium white or liquid white. He doesn't use titanium white, liquid white. And he just holds it. That would be like this turned off. And he's just like, I'm holding my brush and I'm gonna go back to work and do some more painting. I pull it off the canvas, I hold my brush, I go back to work and do some more painting. He picks up his brush. He wants to get a nice clean brush to go do something else with it. And he dips it in that paint thinner and then beats the devil out of it. So if I have this button on, you can think of it as this is the button that makes Bob Ross beat the devil out of his brush every time he picks it up off the canvas. This next one is whether or not you load more paint onto your brush. So same thing, Bob Ross is painting away. Let's say he's working on some trees. And he's got like a 2-inch brush or whatever, and he's got some greens and yellows on there, and he's making some bushes. And he's just kind of he's stippling it onto that canvas, and he pulls it off, and he's just like, I need a little bit more paint. And he dips in some greens, dips in some yellow, and goes back to stippling, pulls it up, needs more paint, dips it in there, and goes back to stippling. Then he's done stippling, or he's trying to feather out that stippling as he's moving into the background. Then, instead of loading up the paint every time, so we would turn this off, he stipples, stops, looks at it, stipples, stops, looks at it without going back and loading up more paint. So is Bob Ross coming back to his palette and loading up more paint? In this case, I'm going to leave both of these on. Next, we have a drop down right here, and as we click it, we can see that we have dry brush all the way down to very wet brush. And so what this is referring to, I shouldn't say brush, canvas. You can think of this as dry or wet canvas, is how wet the canvas is. So again, making those Bob Ross metaphors, if you watch the show a lot, sometimes he'll have a canvas that's dry. Most of the time he'll have a canvas that's wet. So like he'll put down a layer of liquid white and he'll blend through that for the rest of the show. Or he'll be like, I just needed this base color, but I needed it to dry, so I let it dry. So this is how wet the paint is on the canvas, how easy it is for it to be blended out, or can it be blended out at all. Then we get to sliders that are basically these things being controlled. I'm just going to pick moist because that activates all of these sliders. So I have wet, which is how much paint will be taken from the canvas. So like how much blending is going to come from the canvas versus how much blending is going to come from how much pigment blending is going to come from the canvas versus how much is on the brush. Load, how much paint or how long the paint will last when I am making a brush stroke with my mixer brush. Mix controls the ratio of load paint to the mix. So like you can kind of think of it as different viscosities of paint. So like when he's doing little tree branches, he gets a super thin paint because he's doing that as a top layer and it's nice and good for his line art. So you can kind of think of mix as that way. Similarly, you can think of flow in that same kind of boat where it controls the rate that the paint is applied. So how quickly does the loaded paint flow out of the brush? Then we get spray brush, which is actually kind of rad. And basically, the longer you hold down, the more paint that builds up, just like a rattle can or a spray brush. Then we have laziness. So if I have laziness set to 0 and I drag, notice how that red line pretty much stays caught up with my, cursor. Versus if I turn this all the way up and I move it around, see how the red line falls behind my cursor? And so this is just evening out your stroke as you drag it across the canvas. So it makes it easier to get nice smooth lines. If I'm doing lots of short details, I will want to turn that way down because that's doesn't make it, having this turned up makes it so I have to kind of pause after each long stroke. And you can see then I start building up paint at the end. So like there isn't always a right or wrong answer for where you set your smoothing, There's also multiple forms of smoothing. For now, we'll just keep with this particular one. If you are working with pen and tablet, this will turn on pen and tablet override, so it will always work. So even if you're using a brush that doesn't necessarily have pen and tablet capabilities, you can force it to by using this button. All right, so that is a crap ton of words. Like, what does that actually mean? So we've got our new layer right here. And let's just throw some marks onto the screen. So I'm going to come up to here, and I'm going to grab Dry Light Load. And as I drag across the screen, you can see that I very quickly run out of paint. Versus if I come over to Very Wet Heavy Mix, and I drag across the screen, I get a very hard red line. I could just keep going, and it's not going to run out anytime soon. And as I drag across here, notice that I'm not picking up any white. So this is where I need to decide whether or not I want to turn on another button. So if I come up here, I have Sample All Layers. If I turn this on, it will sample all of the layers. And if I drag across here now, we can see basically I'm almost picking up nothing because I'm set to a very wet canvas. I'm picking up almost entirely off the canvas. But as I go through these lines, we can see it starts blending them out with the white. If I drop down in how wet my canvas is, so moist, we can see that I start adding more pigment than I was with very wet, which I was basically I was essentially adding no pigment at all. But if I come back up to dry, we can see that I'm just adding 100% pigment again with almost no canvas blending. Now, there's a bunch of ways to start blending stuff. And we could use the one that we did last chapter. So we could grab the smudge tool, we could get a bigger brush, and we could drag it across these, and it will blend just as if it was an empty brush. Similarly, we could come over to scattering, turn the scattering up a little bit, and this kind of starts evening out the tone, allowing us to make some nice little soft graduations. This, by the way, is where the pen and tablet really comes to shine. So I'm switching to pen tablet right now. And the rate of blending is being very much controlled by the pen tablet. Let's turn you on. There we go. And the harder I press, the more it blends, but I can do gentle blending to really help control the size and rate of blending to make it easier to get a nice continuous tone. Now, the smudge tool is a little limited. Smudge tool is okay. And so I'd rather actually use the mixer brush tool to do my blending. So if I was going to do that, I would come up here and I would, first I would clean my brush, and I would leave clean brush on, and I will turn load brush off. Let's clean the brush one more time. This is rendering erroring and it's bothering me. And what I can do now is I can come over here and I've got my full brush control settings, and I can use those instead of the smudge tool to do that same kind of blending. But I can also come here and change my canvas type to control how that blending is going to interact based on these sliders. This is a way of having a little bit more control with that blending process. Very handy, very neat. And this is what we're going to mostly do for blending in this chapter. Okay, we don't need this layer, so I'm just going to nuke it. Bye-bye. But we do need to start getting ready for our sphere. So I'm going to come up to File, and I'm going to go to Placed Embedded. I'm going to navigate to Reference 1, and I'm going to click Place. Now it comes in much, much too large, so I'm just going to shrink it down, and I'm going to hit Enter to kind of just nestle it off to the side. Move tool, V is the hotkey if you want it. I'm just going to snap it into this top corner so it's nice and out of the way. Let's take a hot minute and examine this to help us decide how we're going to set up our document to draw and paint this. So looking at this image, it's made up of 3, maybe 4 distinct elements. So we have a black background, we have a graduated, but mostly dark table, and then we have a sphere with its shadow. So how we're going to split this up is a black background. We're going to split up all of the light on the table. We're going to group the sphere shadow with that and its reflected light down here. And then we're going to put the sphere on its own layer. Now, in theory, you could actually put the shadow onto its own layer. For us, we're just going to do 3 because I think that's about right for this chapter. When looking at this, we also want to examine the light. So we have a little specular highlight right here. We have our main fill light, or our main direct light, excuse me. We have our ambient fill, which is this dark shadow right here. And then we have reflected light coming up off of the table. And then we have a similar set of lights here on the table itself. So to make our initial image, we're going to make a black box. We're going to use that black box to create a selection that will then modify to make our table, and then we'll use a circular marquee selection to make our sphere. So step one, come down here to the bottom left and click the little black and white box thing to switch these back to black and white. And then we're going to click on the shape tool right here. If you don't have the rectangle, just click and hold to grab rectangle. Up here at the top, it should be fill black. And then for stroke, we're going to put in 0 to zero out the stroke and hit enter, so we don't have anything there. So we don't have an outline around it. Now, just like the text tool, this does two very different things if I click versus if I click and drag. In our case, I am going to click. And I'm going to make this, and I have to type in the unit. So I can't just type in 12. So I have to type in 1, 2, 12, space IN. And then for height, I want to type in 8 space IN. Otherwise, if I just type in 12 by 8, it would do it in pixels of all the infuriating things. And I'll click OK. I'm going to zoom out, Command 0. I'm going to go V for Move Tool, or click on my Move Tool yonder, and I will drag it to be centered on my screen. If your pink lines do not appear, come up to View and turn on Snap, and make sure Snap to all this is turned on. Now I can't see my reference, so I'll drag my reference back up, and I will go back to my rectangle. I'm going to double click on rectangle, and I will label this black background. Next, let's make a selection based on this to do our table. So just like what we saw in Chapter 2, we can Command click a layer preview to select everything in it. So I will hold down the Command key or Control key for Windows on my keyboard, and I will click the Layer Thumbnail Preview in my Layers panel. We can see that that loads this up as a selection. Now I want to modify this selection so it's basically the bottom third of this table. So I'm going to come up to my rectangular marquee selection right yonder. I'm going to make sure my feathering is set to 0. And then I'm going to set my selection mode to subtract. Then I'm going to click anywhere off here to the upper left as long as I'm past the left of my selection and past the top of my selection. And I will click and drag down until about a third of the box is left at the bottom. And I will click and release. And now I have a selection just for this lower area. Next, I'm going to click the New Layer button, and I will click Layer Mask. Now, nothing's happened because we don't have anything in this layer yet, so let's go ahead and fill this in with gray. So I will come over here to my tools, and I'll click and hold on the Gradient tool and pick up the Paint Bucket tool. With the Paint Bucket tool active, I will click on the black box right yonder, where it says B for brightness. I will type in 50% and click OK. And then just click anywhere on the screen to fill in gray. So we can see over here in my layer thumbnail that that whole layer is now currently filled in gray, but only this little section right here is being revealed. So if I right click on this and do disable layer mask, we can see the whole thing is gray. All right, let's make our circle. So kind of basically the same process. I'll come up here to the top left, and I'm going to grab the elliptical marquee tool. If you did not delete the 50px feathering from Chapter 3, now would be a great time to type in 0px, so you're not fighting a soft edge later. And then I'm just going to kind of eyeball the position. So I'm just going to start clicking dragging, and then I'm still holding the mouse key, by the way, Alt-Shift or Alt-Option. And I'm going to get a circle, and I'll just kind of eyeball the size. I don't know, 1200 or so looks pretty good to me. Then I'll hold down the space bar to kind of center it. And we can see that pink line telling me, where are you, Pinky? We'll just eyeball it right about here. Looks pretty good to me. I'm going to release the space bar. I'm going to release the mouse. And then I'm going to release Alt-Option-Shift. Same game as before. New layer, layer mask, make the layer contents active, come over to the paint bucket tool. I'm going to pick white this time. So in this case, I just have to click these little arrows to flip between white and gray. And I will fill this in white. And again, I haven't filled in that circle white. What I've done is I filled the whole layer in with white. And this is an important distinction because like when I'm drawing and painting, I want that white there for while I'm making the sphere so I can blend off of that color. Let's go label stuff. So this layer 1 should be table and shadow. And this will be my sphere layer. And, we'll just go ahead and rename this reference. Okay, next step is to block in our tones. So I'm going to go ahead and come up here, and I'm going to grab my brush tool. And I'm going to come over to my brush settings. Your scatter will be 0 because you haven't putzed with that. And we'll switch to brush tips so our screens will look the same. Over here, I'm going to come to wet media brushes. And no, it should be in wet media. Where's Kyle's Real Oils? Yeah, there it is. We want Kyle's Real Oils 01 because this has got a nice little bit of texture to it. If you want yours to look a little bit better down here, by the way, you can click these lines, and let's go ahead and turn on tip too, so it's easier to see what it is. And then I can also click and drag this to enlarge so we can really see what's going on in here. Now, what we want to do with this is we want to block in our tones. And I'm actually going to start with the table. So I'm going to make the table layer active. Notice I have the layer content active and not the mask. Contents, mask, contents. For all of the stuff we're doing, you need to be in the contents and not the mask. And I'm just going to block it in. So I need a nice dark gray. So I will come over. Let's open up the color panel. Window, color. And you know what? Let's make this a little bit less obtuse. I'm going to click these little lines right here. Let's go to color wheel. And now I've got this little brightness slider right here. So just make sure hue is whatever. Saturation is set to 0. Now you've got a little gray slider right here. So I'm going to grab a nice dark gray. And I'm going to make my brush bigger. You can, instead of having to right click, by the way, to change your brush size, you can use the bracket keys on your keyboard. So bracket left, bracket right, increase or decrease your brush size, which is really handy. And I'm just going to slam in some darker tones right here. And I'm kind of looking at the shape of this right now. And let's do moist for now as I'm blocking this in. I want this even bigger. Oops, that's the layer mask preview. I'll just go ahead and caps lock this so I've got the crosshair so it's less confusing. Again, you don't have to caps locks to hide your brush tip shape. It's just my brush is huge. I should probably click both of these guys back on up here. I was running out of paint. That's why I wasn't darkening anymore. And then I will, let's get this even darker, maybe almost black. And I'll block in a little bit more. I'll block in a little bit more. Maybe I block in that shadow. And a little bit of black over here as well. A little bit down here. Let's get a nice lighter tone. And let's add in our highlight. So my shadow is pointing this direction, so my highlight will point the same direction. Let's get it even brighter. I'm not worried about blending or perfect placement yet. We're going to do that once we get it all blocked in, because getting it blocked in will be easier. Let's come up to our circle layer, and it's rinse and repeat. So I'm going to add in the main shadow. And let's go up in tone, and I'm going to start adding my tone. Notice I'm not quite going down all the way because we got a highlight down there. Maybe that's a little too dark. The other thing is notice that I'm kind of drawing, so my sparkler highlight would be right here. And I'm basically just going to draw little circles around that. So this is kind of a type of cross contouring. That will make it easier to sell the shape of this. Now here in a minute, when I get to blending, the very last thing I would want to do is try to get perfect blending on this. I want to keep some of this awesome texture from this brush, because otherwise it's like, why am I doing this with a brush? I could just use the gradient tool. And the reason why we want some of that texture is because it kind of makes it not feel like a digital painting. So it will feel and look a little bit better. By the way, notice that, so like here's my sphere layer and I'm trying to paint down here. Nothing's happening, and that's because I'm painting in an area that's masked, so I need to come back down to the table to paint that area if I want to actually paint that area. Finally, if you're using a pen and tablet, by the way, you should do a much better job than this. We're going to come up to our brush tip, and we're going to go to scattering, and we'll set it to, I don't know, 100 or so. And then I'm going to set my scattering count to 2. And I'm going to use a little bit smaller of a brush. Oops, I need to get out of there first. There we go. And then I am going to come up here and I'm going to turn off load paint, and I'm going to clean my brush. and I'll draw little circles basically over any area that's overlapped to start blending it out. And you can see that, and I'm doing pretty quick clicks too. I'm not like clicking and holding. I might be click, 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 click. I can't actually blend the circle. Look at me being on the wrong layer. And, you know, I'm a little big right here. Let's drop this down for the circle. There we go. That looks a little bit better. And again, I'm going to follow the shape of the circle while I am blending this out in order to get a nice, attractive appearance for my system. And you know what, maybe I'll even come back through once I've done this initial round of blending and add in more tone in certain areas to kind of help sell where I want stuff. So like this area has gotten a little light right now. So maybe I turn load brush back on and I start adding in some darker tones again into that area. Anyway, go to town on blending this out. And when you're happy with it, go ahead and save your work as a PSD so you have a nice copy of the drawing and painting that you just made. Hopefully this isn't too bad for you and it's a lot of fun. If you're going to be a professional artist again, I really can't stress how much you need to get a pen and tablet display. Because again, here I'll switch to pen tablet. Just how much easier and smoother and more attractive you'll be able to make your blending as you're going through this. I should turn off load. And you'll just end up, I mean, like basically it's almost impossible to get a fantastic result. You can get okay results. It also takes a lot more work using just a mouse. So like also if you're using a mouse for this and you really feel like you're struggling, it's because it's going to be a little bit of a struggle with a mouse. Anyway, hope you have fun and see you guys for the next chapter. Okay, the do-it-yourself is to do kind of the same thing. So we have a reference image over here where we've got a nice black background, we've got a table, and then we've got 3 shapes. Now notice that these 3 shapes are not an easy geometric circle. So like what would be a really easy way to make a mask for each one of these shapes? The answer is use selections. So like you can select those various objects and then convert them into a mask in order to have kind of a automatic paint within the line set up for you. So paint your own image, make sure that each one of these parts is broken into its own thing, and then of course save it as a PSD. Hope you have fun and good luck.